Thank you for joining us. I'm Ed Hoffman, the Director for NASA's Academy for Program Project and Engineering Leadership, and welcome to Masters with Masters. This is a series that brings together two master practitioners who share their stories, lessons, and experiences on the work that we do here at NASA. Today we'll be streaming live across the agency, and the product of this will be able to be available on the Academy's website, the NASA Engineering Network, as well as other sources of distribution. I want to welcome our audience here in Washington, D.C. at NASA headquarters. Part of what we'll be doing today is having questions and answers from the audience here at headquarters, and on each side of the auditorium will be microphones available for you. Please, at that point, stand up and ask your questions. We're hoping for interaction. Since we're streaming, we'll also be going to the centers to be able to get some of your questions for our speakers today. We're very fortunate to have Bobby Braun and Steve Altemus, who I've known for, it seems like, a couple of decades at least. As way of introduction, Bobby Braun is NASA's Chief Technology Officer. He serves as the principal advisor and advocate on matters concerning agency-wide technology policy and programs. Prior to his appointment, he served and he works at Georgia Tech University, where he led a research and education program focused on the design of aerospace, advanced flight systems and technologies for planetary exploration. This also represents Bobby's second tour of duty at NASA. Before joining Georgia Tech, he was at the Langley Research Center, where he was involved in the design, development, testing, and operations of several robotic spaceflight systems, including work on a number of Mars missions. Please welcome Bobby Braun. And we're also fortunate to have Steve Altemus, who was nice enough to fly in today. He is the Director of Engineering at the Johnson Space Center. Steve joined NASA in 1989 as an operations engineer in the Space Shuttle program. He went on to hold several leadership positions in the shuttle organization before playing a leadership role in the reconstruction of the Space Shuttle Columbia after the accident in 2003. Became the Deputy Director of Engineering at Johnson in 2005 before assuming his current position in 2006. Please welcome Steve Altemus.
Thank you, Rick.
And as we were saying, I've known both of you for quite a long time, and when I think of both of you, I think of people who are very passionate and excited about the work you do. When I see you, typically seem to have smiles and a lot of energy. I'd like to start with maybe what got you involved in aerospace, and I'll start with Bobby. What is it, and when did you know that you wanted to be involved in this business?
Well, for me, it was pretty simple. It was a visit to the Goddard Space Flight Center as a boy. One of my neighbors brought me to Goddard, and it happened to be the day of the Viking 1 landing. And to this day, I can still remember that trip to Goddard. And you know, it wasn't so much the science of Viking, which was tremendous, or even the engineering. But what got me hooked was all the people that had devoted their lives to that mission, to make that mission successful, and to watch them all jump up and down with excitement when that lander hit the soil safely for the first time. I was hooked on engineering right there, and it led me in that direction through high school and college, and then ultimately back to NASA.
So the challenge of the work and the outcomes of what take place there.
The challenge, the camaraderie, the requirements for a team to actually work together. This was an accomplishment that no single person could have done on their own. And that was, the kind of thing I wanted to be involved with.
And Steve, you, I know your background educationally, you went to Embry-Riddle and University of Central Florida. What is it that got you excited about the career you ended up pursuing?
Well, actually, let's see. I went to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University to learn how to fly jets, right? To learn how to fly airplanes. But I quickly learned that I was more interested in how they worked and the high energy systems that were associated with them more than operating them. And so I switched to engineering very quickly in my educational career and went into aeronautical engineering, and I loved everything about airplanes. And it wasn't until walking across from the engineering building to the university center, I recall the day that we lost the Challenger and I was walking, and I saw the plume from the launch, and there it separated into pieces, and you could see the multiple plumes going up. And at that point, I walked over to the University Center, and they were talking about the Challenger and whether or not the orbiter was going to fly through it. I knew at that moment that my destiny or my career was going to cross with NASA, and I was enamored with NASA ever since, and began a career right after I graduated, essentially.
Right. And you mentioned Challenger. You started in 1989, so it was in the kind of mid-time where we were dealing with the Challenger accident and learning from that. And you also later on in your career played a key role contributing to learning from Columbia and redesigning, reconstruction, and moving ahead with there. From the standpoint of learning as an organization, what did those events teach you about how we as an organization learn from failure?
I think you could say, it was interesting because a number of folks are writing a book on the shuttle, and one of the sections in the book that's going to be published in January is about the accidents. And my arguments about the accidents themselves is that they turned out to be, they tend to mar our history a little bit, but in fact, they are the times of greatness, too, for the agency. And you could see that the agency really rallies around solving the technical problems, and the focus of the workforce is all about getting back to flight. And so that was the mindset of the team when I came to Johnson Engineering in 2005 when they were trying to prepare back for return to flight. And what you saw was just an incredible effort to fully understand, pique their curiosity about what they could do to help solve the design problems, harden the orbiter, right, develop repair tools. And but on the downside, so there's that. But I think when you talk about what we learned as a learning organization associated with Columbia, was the pendulum swung a little bit too far. In thinking about the Columbia Accident Board and the idea that every dissenting opinion had to be raised to the highest level, we've since matured from that position, which was tended to be over-constraining. And we've gotten to a point now where we're talking about informed dissent, where people who understand the complexities of the issue that we're working, they raise the issue up, and then we deal with it squarely and maturely as we go forward. So that's how the organization learned from the accident, rebuilt itself, and now maturely steps forward to deal with the tough technical issues that keep us flying.
So trying to find the right balance between learning from and acting on, but not overreacting to, trying to find that right level.
Exactly.
Sounds like. And Bob, I know you started at Langley, and you're involved in a lot of new technology and work on Mars-type programs. You've been involved in different project review boards. What are the key lessons from failures that we've had that you've learned that stays with you, particularly now that you're starting a new organization with focus on pushing the envelope, but also being successful?
Yeah, well, so early in my career, I worked on a couple of Mars missions. Some of them succeeded. I worked on Mars Pathfinder, for example, almost from the time it was an idea through the development of that hardware and the flight of the mission all the way to the landing on the surface on July 4th, 1997. And I also worked on some Mars missions that didn't succeed. I worked in particular on the Mars Microprobe mission, which was a new Millennium program. It was called Deep Space 2. It was carried to Mars along with the Mars Polar Lander, and it was lost in 1999 along with the Polar Lander. And what I'd say, really, by comparing those two experiences is that, you're never as good as you think you are on the day you succeed, and you're never as bad as you feel on the day you fail. And in both cases, I worked on pretty small teams, teams that were, fully charged to get the job done. We all were empowered as engineers to make the tough decisions, to trade risk versus performance versus cost. We were making those trades on a daily basis. In some cases, I think we made those trades well. In other cases, we may have been pushed a little bit to go a little farther than we should. But when I think about those two experiences, there's no doubt in my mind that I learned more from the failure than I did from the success. The introspection that Steve mentioned that comes after a failure, was very valuable, not just to me, but to everyone that worked on that team. And a lot of folks that worked on, in my case, Mars Microprobe, but also on Mars Polar Lander or the Mars Climate Orbiter that also failed in '99, those folks went on to even bigger things in their career, right? And the Mars Exploration Rovers had some people from the Mars Polar Lander team. The Phoenix lander Mars Scout lander that recently landed had a lot of the same Lockheed Martin folks, for example, not just NASA folks, but people in industry that had worked on Polar Lander. And Mars Odyssey, of course, was enabled by some of the problems that we had with Mars Climate Orbiter. So what I tend to do is I tend to think of each mission not just on its own in terms of a success or a failure, but as a learning experience. And I think, frankly, that's what NASA is all about. If we're going to push the edge, if we're going to do cutting-edge work, we have to be continually learning. And the day we stop learning is the day that this agency stagnates. And that's not something I'm interested in.
Yeah, Bobby, when we talk about failure, right? It's okay to fail. And we have to come to grips with that as an agency, right? That even on some high-profile tests, for example, the whole point is to uncover things that maybe didn't go right in your analysis or your design. So the idea of learning from failure, you learn an order of magnitude or so more by a failure than you do by a success. And so we ought to really cultivate in our young engineers the idea that it's okay to fail in the lab or in their designs or early on in their projects and learn from those and cultivate those failures and turn them into wins and successes for the agency, as opposed to being punitive or expecting too much right out of the gate. So I think it's an important tenet.
I knew you when you both started off, in terms of practitioners early in your career. Now you're in senior leadership, positions. How has the experience from the education, from the work that you do, from university experience, how does it gear you up towards what you're preparing for NASA and its practitioners now in areas like, the current challenges that we have and the transitions towards new ways of doing things?
I'll take it if you like.
Go ahead.
So for me, the experience of leaving NASA, as difficult as it was for me to do in 2003, of leaving NASA and going to an academic institution, to Georgia Tech, has really shaped my thinking. Because at Georgia Tech and at universities, frankly, all around the country, we push the students every day to failure. We assign, if they get the homework assignment right, the next one's going to be more challenging. If they're in the lab, we want them to do laboratory tests where some of them are successful and some of them are failures. We want them to have work experiences like that as well. And most of the universities in the country are set up that way. The laboratories are set up that way. They're constantly, if you go to a university campus, they're building new labs all the time. They're bringing in new equipment to test out new theories and to kind of push the envelope. And just seeing that, frankly, has really affected the way I view the agency now, coming back into NASA. I think NASA can do that as well. I think NASA, frankly, needs to do that as well. It certainly used to have that kind of mentality, a mentality where we were pushing the boundaries, where we were defining what aeroscience meant. It wasn't just pure engineering. There was a science aspect, a why, if you will, to our experiments and to our analyses. And I think that's very important to the agency still today.
Yeah, I think it's actually what shaped me the most has been being close to the hardware my whole career. Right, so being at Kennedy Space Center and being able to walk around and crawl through orbiters and understand the stack as you go up and down the boosters and see the processing occurring and walk the launch pad before every launch. Being close to the hardware, understanding the scale and the size of the hardware. It's always been something that I would preach to the younger folks, the co-ops, is stay close to the hardware. Even if you're just if you're a designer or an analyst or a test engineer, you got to be with your hands dirty, working with the hardware, and that's where you get a real appreciation. Where a more as you grow in your career, you get a more intuitive sense of what's a good design or what's a decent analysis or when something doesn't look quite right. And that comes from years and years of being close to the hardware. So I think we need that in the agency. And so it's really fortunate that a lot of folks like Bobby and Mike Ruskevich, the chief engineer, are pushing for significant increase in the amount of in-house work we're going to do in the agency. That's so important to keep our young folks, all folks at different levels in their career, working with the hardware, designing things.
Yeah, and if I could just follow on to that a little bit, that's something that we don't do uniformly well in the universities, right? In the university setting, we teach undergraduates, for instance, the foundational skills that they need across all the aerospace disciplines. But very few undergraduates get to be a part of a project from across the whole life cycle, from concept all the way to flight. And so for our young engineers coming into NASA to have developmental experiences like Steve is referring to here is very important.
Right. Yeah, in a few minutes I'm going to go to the audience here for some of their questions, but you seem to be touching on what's always been a discussion issue, which is acceptable risk. Mm-hmm. So for an organization, I'll start probably with Bobby, with an organization that does one-of-a-kind missions, that is supposed to push the envelope, but also wants to have success, how do we define acceptable risk, and how do we approach the whole issue of what's acceptable when we're dealing with risk?
Well, I think the agency needs to think about this really hard. And the way I view acceptable risk is kind of in a tiered sense. Obviously, for a human spaceflight system where astronauts are on board, where lives are at risk, and safety is, paramount, we're going to, be very careful, and we're not going to take a lot of risk. We're going to try to drive all the risk out of the system as best we can. But that failure is not an option mentality. While it might be acceptable in some cases for human spaceflight, we certainly don't want to take that approach across the board. And so as you go from human spaceflight to, let's say, large flagship missions in our Science Mission Directorate, where we're, by the way, risking a great deal of money, a great deal of people's time, I think we can take more risk with those systems. Still, we need to be careful because of the investments being made. And as you move from our large flagship missions down to smaller competed missions, and certainly down to technology development, the area that I'm focused in the new office of the Chief Technologist, I think there we have to take risk, right? Technology development without risk, frankly, I don't know how to do that. The only time in my career that I ever felt like I was being innovative, and I'm not actually sure that I was, but I at least felt that way. The only time I ever felt like I was being innovative is when I was taking risk, and I was making decisions in an informed risk-taking manner, where I was balancing risk versus performance versus cost. And if in our technology programs, if we're going to be going after grand challenges, if we're going to be, as you say, pushing the envelope, doing cutting-edge things, we absolutely have to be able to do that. So I like to think about acceptable risk in a tiered manner, as I've been describing. And unfortunately, in the agency, I would say that from time to time, it's been more of a pendulum approach, where we take a lot of risk for a while and then we get snake bit, and so we become very risk averse. And I think that for an agency like NASA, there has to be a balance. And there has to be a balance across time and across these different types of missions in the way we deal with risk.
I would say, though, Bobby, that if you look at, this is where we get into a little debate, right? Mm-hmm. So I generally agree with your perspective about balance, right? That makes a lot of sense. But if you look at, for example, we're talking about return to flight, how the shuttle team itself and how the space station team themselves have matured to the point where we deal with risk every single day. Mm-hmm. And we manage the risk. And I agree again with the tiers, but there's two things. There's our understanding of the risk, which is limited, and then the actual risk that you're dealing with, right? And so there's a gap between our understanding and the real risk, we've got to go learn how to deal with that and how to run human spaceflight programs, at least in my case, exist in human spaceflight programs that allow you to deal with that risk. And fly time after time after time. Otherwise, you'd want to stay on the ground. And so we've learned to fly missions and fly crews on space station without systems being pristine, right? By understanding the risks associated with next-level failures, by having the kind of functional redundancy we have on space station. And then look on shuttle. You can't run flight after flight after flight since return to flight with such a success record without understanding and appreciating the risks that go in each time. For example, when we went back to return to flight, we absolutely had a very low risk tolerance. The pendulum did swing. But the team has significantly matured over time to where we've gotten into situations where we don't fully understand the risk. We know there's some residual risk, as Brian O'Connor likes to say. Yet we talk about it. We talk about the uncertainties associated with the risk on a particular problem, and then we decide whether or not among all the other constraints that weigh into flying programs, whether that risk is in balance with the rest of the risks we have. One example would be, look at shuttle and station and how integrated they are. When you keep the shuttle on the ground, that puts station and the station crew at risk to some degree. Sure. And so you have to make those technical risk decisions in context of coupled programs and whether or not we have the right risk balance. And I think the agency, in particular in SOMD, has done a really great job lately of trying to find and navigate way through these tough technical issues and still continue to fly.
Yeah, I think that we're saying actually the same thing in different ways, maybe. I believe what you're saying, Steve, is that it's through understanding the system that we understand the risk, and we can then make those trades. And so it's by empowering the engineers that are the ones that actually understand the system, right? Empowering them with that responsibility to make those decisions, as opposed to trying to bubble that all up to the top every time, that we can make informed risk trades. And I think that's true whether you're talking about a human spaceflight system or whether we're talking about the next robotic mission to Mars. The one thing that I learned on Pathfinder, Mars Pathfinder, I learned every day is the people down in the trenches that are closest to the knowledge are actually best able to make these risk trades. And on Pathfinder, it was a beautiful environment because it allowed those people to actually make those decisions. That's the way the Mars Pathfinder team was run from day one. And it was a great, when I look back on it, it was a great developmental experience for me. Colored my whole approach to my professional career. But I think it was also a great developmental experience for everyone else on that team as well.
Well, I think when you talk to any of the younger folks coming into the agency today, whether you're talking about cooperative education students or new hires, the number one thing that they ask for is accountability. Yeah. Let me be responsible for and accountable for some deliverable. Mm-hmm. And that's what engages and excites or motivates our workforce. So I absolutely agree with that.
And both in terms of what you're talking about, there's the balance between the need to innovate, do things differently, go in new directions, but at the same point do it with professionalism and making sure that we've done the best effort. And maybe that's one of the things we'll come back to, the whole issue of innovation in a one-of-a-kind organization.
When I first heard about this event, I was very happy to see the leaders for space technology development and human spaceflight sitting together amicably on the same stage. I thought, there you go. That made me feel good as an S employee, so I appreciate that. So one of the things I was thinking about as you guys were talking is about risk, and especially about technology risk and technology maturity. It's very important to think about, especially from a human spaceflight point of view, as we think about what we're being asked to do in the future. We're going to have to do things that we haven't been able to do in the past. And one of the things that when you're developing an actual project to have people on it, you have to be careful about what maturity the technology is. You can't afford to have that much risk. So what's important for NASA to do is project ahead and think about what technology needs to be developed and then work hand in hand with the people planning on what the human framework is going to be. And so I was wondering if you believe NASA's architecture and communication paths are ready.
Let me just give a thought that came to mind while you were asking the question, Bill. One comes to mind is pool technology, right? The idea that you can go faster with a compelling need and a sense of urgency, and so I think that On-ramping technologies because you need them to accomplish a mission, say it's a NEO mission or an asteroid mission, you've got to have that pool to really make the progress you need, right? You won't necessarily get breakthroughs in areas that you're not studying, but in fact, in the areas that are absolutely essential, you're going to pull those along and move them a lot faster. So that kind of came to mind as soon as we were talking. It's kind of interesting, the dichotomy that we're in right now as an agency, where we're talking about lean development, lean engineering, skunk works kinds of things, and yet on the other hand, we talk about technology infusion into projects. And if you look at Kelly Johnson's 14 Rules of Successful Skunk Works, right? One of the things that he absolutely says is don't put technology in the critical path. Yet on the other hand, we're trying to infuse technology into the critical path for development of hardware. So we've got to wrestle with that as an agency and say, what's the right balance of new technology in these developments that still allow us to reach our goals?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, the Exploration Systems Mission Directorate, I think, has been doing a very good job of not just planning out the missions for human spaceflight over the next couple decades, but flowing those mission requirements down into spacecraft requirements and from spacecraft and subsystem requirements into technology requirements. And the recent work actually that the HEF team, the Human Exploration Frameworks team, did prioritized those technology investments. And I thought, I reviewed those as a member of the steering council, and I thought it was done in a very logical manner. So I think ESMD has done a good job of understanding the technology requirements for the various future missions that we're looking at. And what our challenge is now as an agency is to figure out how to develop those technologies so that they're ready in time for infusion into those operational missions. And I think it's critical that we do that because, frankly, we can't continue to run missions of the future on 1960s and 1970s technology. It won't work if we want to land more mass on the surface of Mars, just robotically. We already know that the Mars Science Lab is about the limit with the 1960s Viking era technology. And so, that's just one example. But the same is true, frankly, if regardless of where we look, whether it's our future science missions or our future human exploration missions. Yeah, one last comment. I don't know why you're surprised that Steve and I are sitting up here together. Okay, because just to be clear, technology spans all the mission directorates, right? There's technology in aeronautics, obviously. There's technology in the Science Mission Directorate and certainly in human spaceflight, both within ESMD and SOMD.
And I think the trick is going to be, at this point, like we talked about, pool technologies and technologies that span the different mission directorates. It's what are those technologies that we should be working on that aren't necessarily called out by any major program? What are those push technologies that show promise? And having the ability as an agency to make investments in some technologies that won't pan out, but know that you've spread it out far enough that you're going to get some hits, you're going to get some shots on goal with the technologies that you are investing in. That's going to be a tricky job, and I think Bobby's got that in his.
Sounds like a good plan, though.
Okay. Let's go to another question here in Washington.
We live in a society which rewards success and punishes failure. How do we manage expectations so that we can take more informed risks? That's a question that we all struggle with in NASA.
Yeah.
Let's see. The question was, how do we manage in a society of zero tolerance for failure? Is that essentially what you're?
Yes.
You want to
society where success is reinforced and failure we get punished for, and how do we, again, this whole theme of risk and maybe how is it different from when you started your career? There seems to be a key focus on that.
Yeah, well, I'll take a shot at that one. I think the question is correct, right? I think there is certainly a perception in the agency that every time we push the button and we launch something, whether it's a human spaceflight system or a $50 million technology experiment that's going to fly in space, that has to be successful. That, we've spent too much money, too much time, too much effort. It's front page news, and it can't fail. And in thinking about this a lot, I think we do this to ourselves. I think the engineers of this agency, of which I'm a part, I am one, I think we put ourselves in a box with that thinking. Sure, there have been times when we've failed, and the ramifications have been significant, right? There have been major independent review boards, there have been congressional inquiries, those kinds of things. And it hasn't been fun, right, for anyone who's been involved in those failures, myself included. Okay? But that doesn't mean that it's not acceptable to fail. You can take a place. Look at DARPA, just as an example, right? Just recently, DARPA flew I think it was about Mach 20. I'm not exactly sure. They flew a hypersonic test vehicle that went about Mach 20. And the headline story in the Washington Post was, DARPA breaks speed record. Right? And down in paragraph 4, if you read all the way down, it said, oh, and by the way, they lost the vehicle. Prematurely, they lost the vehicle. Right? I think that within the agency, we think, whether it's true or not, we think that the headline would have been reversed. We think the headline would have been, NASA fails. And then down in paragraph 4, it would have said, as they were going for a world speed record, isn't that cool? Right? Well, regardless, we can't think that way. All right? We need to change the way we approach these kinds of problems. And over a wide spectrum of activities, failure has to be an acceptable outcome some percentage of the time. Otherwise, we're going to get to the state pretty soon where we don't even launch anything, right? Because the only way I know not to fail at all is to not do our job and to just do endless studies and have meetings and meetings, to discuss things, but to never actually launch. So once again, I'll go back to this tiered risk approach and empowering our engineers and actually making risk-informed trades throughout the design process and managing risk, not mandating a certain risk level, but managing risk, figuring out where the high-risk pieces of that system are and attacking those pieces to mitigate the risk of those pieces failing as much as we can. And then at some point, elevating that to the right level, and that doesn't necessarily mean to the administrator every time, but to the right level where that risk can be assessed and a decision to go can be made. Another thing that we can do is we can actually celebrate our failures. Right? This is not something that NASA typically does. But as I said earlier, every time we fail, we can learn from that failure. And if we're learning, what's wrong with celebrating learning? What's wrong with celebrating the knowledge that we gained from a particular failure that we're then going to apply to a future mission? Not all risks have to be not all failures have to result in funerals, is what I'm trying to say. And just to close this out, at least from my perspective, the failure that I was involved with most significantly was the Mars 99 missions. We lost, as I mentioned, we lost the orbiter and the lander and the 2 microprobes that I worked on in that opportunity, in that time frame. It was 2 separate launches. They both made it to Mars. Neither mission was successful. And it was a difficult time afterwards. It was a time of introspection, a time of, us figuring out how to fix the program. But Congress didn't cancel the Mars program. And the people that worked on those activities got stronger from that experience and have now brought this nation successes, much more significant, actually, successes than those missions that failed. So sometimes when I think back on the 99 failures, I wonder to myself, were they really failures? Or were they just part of the learning process required to get at the bigger, more complex missions that we all want to do. And I think that's maybe the way the agency needs to think about this a little bit more.
Yeah, I think one of the sources of pride that I think we all should have in working for an agency that's called NASA is that we are held to a standard that's up here with respect to failure. They don't expect NASA to fail. They expect NASA to be good. They expect NASA to be excellent in everything it does. And that should be our source of pride. We are, I agree with Bobby, incredibly hard on ourselves internally in the agency when we do have a failure. Right? If you look at the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, and what the administrator gave us at the time was accept, comply, and embrace all the findings of the accident board. It was almost like mea culpa. You know, we had to beat ourselves a little bit and carry the burden for a while because we had a failure. We've got to teach ourselves and act differently about failures. And I agree that we've got to actually embrace failures from a standpoint of what did they teach us? How are we going forward with that? Well, how are we taking this newfound knowledge and this curiosity that comes from failure and applying it to our next greatest challenges? So I actually very much agree with the way Bobby described it. But be proud of the agency, and when they criticize us for a failure, turn that into a positive. That we work in a particular agency where they don't expect us to fail. They expect us to be this good. And that should be a source of pride.
Okay. I know we have a question now from the Langley Research Center. So why don't we open the lines to Langley?
Hi, my name is Robin Thompson, and I'm a counterintelligence special agent at Langley Research Center. And a lot of the risk that you've been talking about has been the trial and error of more of the physical science part of the technology advances. And I want to look at it from a different perspective, and that is the risk of your properties or your technologies or information being either stolen or obtained by our foreign adversaries. And I'm wanting to look at it, you know, it's great to fail in the lab and advance technology, but if I fail at my job, then that means that the credit of your technological advances goes to someone else. So my question is, as part of the risk management process, is there coordination with any of the counterintelligence offices at the centers? Is that required as part of that process?
So I guess how do we deal with security risks to obviously our technological and other resources from the standpoint of security? And
I'd like to make a comment. I don't know if I'm going to answer your question directly, but as we work in more of a global economy, and NASA works with international partners, the idea of trading technical data and trading information becomes imperative to our collective success, right? And so we've got to find ways to be able to communicate with our partners in an open dialogue, technical dialogue, with the data that's available. Now, there are security threats, but we can't let the security threats diminish our partnerships or take away from them. The ITAR controls, export controls that we have to live with today are really stifling when it comes to things like building an international docking standard with a consortium of countries from around the world. Building the International Space Station by itself is a feat alone, just to work through the bureaucracy of the IT security and the ITAR regulations and export control. It's amazing that we could actually do that. We've got to find a way to work with the international partners in a more open way with our technical data, I think.
That's good. Yeah, if I just add one point there, we invest in technology for a number of reasons, right? We invest in technology because it's the right thing to do for our future missions in aeronautics, science, and exploration. We also invest in technology because it's a source of high-paying jobs in this country. It's the way we build new industries. It's the way the United States maintains its technological leadership in the world. And so while I agree with what Steve said, I also want to point out it's very important that NASA, as part of the federal government, make these technology investments. Because the United States is not the only country that has realized that through these types of investments is the source of a better future for its own citizens in this next century. Both in the ways that I mentioned, and through economic means, through STEM, educational, and professional career paths. So the fact that NASA hasn't invested heavily in technology over the past, say, 5 or more years, I actually view as a threat, in a way, to our national security. So I'm very proud that NASA is now moving forward with more technology investment.
Okay. Told we have a follow-up to that? No follow-up. Okay. I was told wrong. Another question here at headquarters.
Yes, as you very well know, in our flight projects, we spend a lot of time in formal risk management and risk mitigation through probabilistic risk assessments and risk matrices in every meeting. The question is, when it comes to technology programs, to what extent should we engage ourselves in those formal practices? Are they over-constraining? Practices like probabilistic risk assessment and looking at risk matrices and trying to mitigate risk, or is it applicable and useful?
Yeah, well, so I think it depends a little bit on your definition of technology development and what type of technology development activity we're talking about, right? And unfortunately, technology development can span a wide range of things, running all the way from a couple $100K for some systems study up to several $100 million for an in-space demonstration of a new technology, basically a flight project of its own, right? So as you approach that end of the spectrum where we're talking about flight projects, then certainly the same kind of techniques that we use in our robotic missions and in our human spaceflight missions to assess risk posture, like probabilistic risk assessment, should be used. But if we're talking about someone has an innovative idea and they're just getting started on that idea and they need to do like a technology assessment or do a systems analysis to kind of mature that thought from just the raw thought itself to basically to an AIAA paper, if you will, or a journal article where they can explain their thought in more detail to more people, well then for something like that I really wouldn't expect that level of analysis. In this new office, in the Office of the Chief Technologist and in the new Space Technology Program, I should point out there are technology programs that span that whole range that I just mentioned, all the way from small-scale awards for new innovative concepts all the way up to flight projects. And we are scaling the requirements for insight and oversight, for risk assessment and insight and oversight, proportional to where you are on that spectrum.
Yeah, I would say that just to follow on to that just a little bit, not just technology and your risk management process, but your development cycle for any spaceflight hardware. At what point do you apply the rigor in the process to the right degree? And I think that's what you're pulling on, right? Is there's a continuum, and to apply, everybody picks on poor 7120.5, but 7120.5 to everything that we do is not the right implementation, and the document doesn't even require that. So it's understanding what it is we're actually trying to accomplish and applying the right level of process, whether it's risk management process or whether it's a set of technical standards, whatever the right level of process is at that phase of the development, right? So in your early on laboratory work, you're going to have a looser framework to work in, freer and more innovative environment. And as you move into pre-phase A and phase B, until you get to when you bring contracts on, I guess, you have to tighten up exactly what your expectations are in terms of requirements and standards that you're going to levy on the contractor, and then you go from there. And when you get into operational flight programs, the mindset changes again to the point where you have a different set of things that you're looking at. You're trying to investigate sustaining engineering problems and things. So that there's a different level of kind of risk tolerance for flight programs too, where you're trying to fly with that risk and understand that risk so that you can continue to fly. So I think that should be across the board and not just confined to technology. I think we ought to think about that continuum in all of our processes within the agency.
That's a good point.
Okay. We have not one of the questions we've been talking about technical risk, obviously, but there's also a lot of factors in terms of social risk, in terms of openness and communication, which was years ago a key issue that came out in many of the reports. It seems now there's much more of an open dialogue amongst engineering, safety, program, project teams across the agency. And when I was at the STS 119 flight readiness review, we had the anomaly that came up. And to me, sitting back, it was amazing to watch the argument, the discussion, but the eventual resolution. Can you comment on, I guess I'll start with Steve, the openness of communications when it comes to issues of risk and the missions that we're involved with? And do you see it having changed over time?
Again, I see it as maturing over time. And 119 in particular, that flow control valve issue, was an example of just how mature the teams have gotten. That was a very difficult situation where, let me just paint the picture a moment, where we were getting towards a point in the station program where we were trying to commit to our international partners to go to a 6-person crew. We were relying on the Soyuz launches to get us to that point, and the shuttle launch had to occur prior to put some logistics and assembly to get the water system up and running to support 6-person crew just prior to the Soyuz launching to activate 6-person crew in May. So that shuttle launch in February and March timeframe was crucial to the success of 2 programs and international aspects to the thing. So here we come with a technical issue that's down deep into the vehicle of a flow control valve in a gaseous hydrogen system, where we had an acoustic resonance problem that was causing pieces of that poppet in that particular valve to break off and potentially cause damage in the orbiter. And so we went back to the flight readiness review 3 times in that case under incredible pressure or constraints. It wasn't any pressure levied by anyone, but constraints in the bigger context or risk in the bigger context. And we went back with a technical argument and said, we tried to sharpen our pencil and we didn't get there. We looked at the likelihood of failure and the consequence of failure. We were at the limits of our analysis tools, the point where we could not do any better. We went back and said we couldn't quite characterize the risk for you. The agency, the flight readiness review process was mature enough to send us back and to delay the launch. We came back a second time after we had done some testing, and we tried to break down the risk in terms of what are the uncertainties of each part of the risk that we're trying to accept and put a distribution on that risk. And we still weren't ready, and we still didn't have a tight analysis. So we came back a third time, and we were able to come back before the launch window closed in that particular March and lay out specific distributions, to have the technical conversation about specific distributions of where the uncertainty lied in each part of our analysis. We got away from working a worst-on-worst risk assessment that says you can't fly with this problem, to really diving down and trying to understand exactly where the risk lay, how well did we understand it, where did we not understand it, and putting that risk in context of the broader programmatic risks. And I think that shows just an incredible amount of maturity in terms of the Space Ops Mission Directorate and how they manage to keep us flying, because it is easy to stay on the ground. It is very difficult to keep the shuttle and the space station flying with the international partners. And that was just a tough, hard technical issue to resolve, and I think the team did a wonderful job with that. The other learning experience that we had there is learning how to listen to the team and how ideas were coming up on how to solve the problem along the way that allowed us to revector and actually find some NDE techniques to go understand and better characterize the risk of what was actually on the vehicle. it was so successful in my perspective, and a lot of folks were critical of that whole case study now in retrospect there at the time. But it was so successful that as a result of those findings in that whole flow control valve issue for 119, we are still implementing what came out of those flight readiness reviews in terms of screening out bad parts off the orbiters and screening out parts that we're making brand new before they end up on the orbiters. And we're continuing to fly the program with that same issue. There has been no design change. It's just understanding risk, managing the risk, and dealing with it appropriately. So I consider that a success for the agency.
Yeah, it was an amazing process to watch, a team coming together, and you see it as part of the maturity of the organization, understanding the processes. I understand we have a question from the Ames Research Center, so let's open it up to Ames.
Yes, Bob, I have a question for you. I wanted to probe a little deeper into what you mean by taking more risk in the OCT projects. And kind of using a flight test project as an example, I would imagine we would want to take less risk in all the subsystems that would be supporting a given technology that we want to test in flight. And so the risk itself would be mostly focused on the technology. So from an overall project standpoint, maybe it's less risk because you've been more conservative in all those subsystems. You don't want a failure in a subsystem that's not associated with testing that technology in space. So I'm wondering, is that what you mean when you talk about taking more risk, or do you mean something else?
Yeah, so let me answer that question a couple different ways. First of all, just in general, I think that the agency has some pretty large goals in front of it, particularly in human spaceflight, but certainly in the other enterprises that the agency pursues as well. And personally, I believe that the only way that we're going to accomplish some of these goals is if we reform the practices that we use and we take a little bit more risk. And I say that in a general sense across the board. If you're going after a grand challenge, you're not going to get there in an incremental sense. Okay? Now, to get specifically at the example that you've highlighted, let's say that you want to, just to put some specifics on it, let's say that you want to flight test a new heat shield material. I know they do that sometimes out at NASA Ames. So let's say you want to flight test a new heat shield material, and to get that heat shield material up into space, you obviously need a spacecraft to control it after it leaves the launch vehicle. You need a structure to mount that heat shield material on. You need avionics, GN&C, propulsion, all of these things, right? So the way that the Office of the Chief Technologist would pursue that particular example is we would put out a call for a capability, and that capability could be the heat shield material, okay? And then multiple teams in the community could respond to that call. One team could respond just as you've suggested, and everything could be off the shelf, as low risk as it could be, with the exception of that heat shield material. And another team could respond by putting forward that same heat shield material and the risk associated with that heat shield material. But they might also throw on a new propulsion system, right, that also has not been flight proven in space yet. The trade then becomes between those two proposals in this hypothetical example, the cost associated with those two systems versus the risk versus the reward. Is that propulsion system also of value to the agency as the agency pursues its future missions? And if it is of value, is the cost associated for proving that extra subsystem and the risk associated with that extra subsystem worth it in the selection process? Now, I can't tell you up front what the answer is, because the answer is going to depend. It's going to depend a little bit on the capability that we're soliciting. It's going to depend a little bit on the responses from the community, the experience and the capabilities of each of those teams. Do we believe them? How well do we believe them in their ability to actually implement the mission and to meet the proposed cost and that sort of thing? But it's that trade. It's that trade between risk, taking more risk, and the value to the agency and the cost of doing so that we do intend to evaluate in these technology programs when we make these solicitations, when we make these awards. Does that make sense?
Any follow-up on that?
Made sense.
Makes sense to me.
Okay.
Any questions here?
Hey, can I add on to something that
Yes,
Steve said
certainly.
earlier before the caller from Amy?
Go ahead, Bob.
So he got me thinking. You were talking about social aspects, communication aspects, and I think that the example you used, Steve, is awesome. I think it's definitely true in the human spaceflight program that they're making it appear, or you all are making it appear. I wouldn't say easy, because it's definitely not easy, but it's a very well engineered process, and it's a very impressive process. The one thing I did want to point out from the science side of things in the science missions is that social aspect crosses engineering and science. And one of the things that I've always found interesting about our science missions is there's this interaction between the science team and what the science team wants and the engineering team that's trying to implement those science requirements. And oftentimes, over the course of a mission, we'll start out with a certain set of science requirements, and the engineers will believe, frankly, that they can achieve those science requirements. And over time, they'll realize that, this last 10% of the science requirement is costing 90% of the effort and is going to result in a schedule slip or a cost increase. And so the engineers and the scientists will get together and they'll actually hash that out. And they'll say, well, instead of developing this system that we were trying to develop that now looks like it's going to be an overrun, maybe operationally we can deal with the situation a little differently. Or maybe we can back off a little bit on that requirement. And I've seen a number of examples in the Mars program and in other programs within the Science Mission Directorate where this trade between science and engineering has been done very effectively. And it all centers on communications and trust and thorough analysis, frankly. The engineers don't walk into the room with just ideas. They walk into the room with well thought out, rigorous analyses to support their position. And the scientists, frankly, do a very good job of being open, of listening, of actually understanding. There are many scientists that I've worked with that are great engineers and can just get into the engineering details of their measurement system like you wouldn't believe. And they fully understand what the engineers are saying before a decision is reached. And it's that interaction, I think, is very special. And it's something that NASA does extremely well.
I would add to that so a key takeaway from that is allowing the requirements to be held at the right level.
Yeah, exactly.
So that when you want to challenge a requirement because it has a ridiculous cost associated with it, that the engineers in the system, or the safety, or the flight crew, or the technical organizations within the system can actually challenge those requirements, push back on them, and then that's heard at the appropriate level and dispositioned quickly. So by holding that at too high a level, that means that any change to those requirements takes a series of boards and panels all the way up the chain to get to the eventual resolution. The further down in the organization that you push that, the faster you can move and you can get to the innovative good ideas about how folks can make it cheaper, can develop it faster, can get you the same technical content potentially or not. But you've got to get that down into the engineers' hands. And you've got to get the engineers thinking that, or the technical communities thinking that they are empowered to change these requirements, that they ought to be, as NASA, pushing back on the requirements. They can't be held as sacred requirements. There is no such thing, right? You've got to be able to challenge all assumptions and challenge all requirements.
Yeah, that's a great way of saying it.
Oh, pretty good. We're going to try once again at the Marshall Space Flight Center, so we'll open it up and see if we hear you.
Hello? Can you hear us? This question is for Bobby and for Steve. From your perspective, what role does information technology play in helping the engineering organization identify and manage risks?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things information technology should be, here I'll preach a little bit, information technology should be a tool for the technical organizations to succeed in design, development, test, and analysis. It should not be a hindrance, right? And so if we have systems that are causing us pain or are causing us hardship in terms of getting everybody access to those systems, if they stifle communications at all, we've got to go address that problem. IT systems are there to enable us to communicate, to make good decisions, to keep good records and track of the technical requirements and the technical issues. So I think that that's one piece to get on with. And how we use those IT systems to manage risk, I think it's a healthy way to understand, verification requirements where you've met or where you haven't met the VMV requirements, where you can where there might be some risk in the certification process. You've got to tally all that up, and the IT systems can be very useful in helping us wade through the reams and reams of data that are associated with complex systems. Yeah. But they ought to be user-friendly, and there's been a lot of complaints from the working troops about ice and wind chill and those kinds of systems that we're forced to use in the human spaceflight side of things. And so what we ought to do is look at ourselves as an agency and decide where is the value, and let's put our energy in the most valuable aspects of accomplishing missions and try to find ways to streamline processes and tools in a way that it maximizes the value. And that was one example of kind of an area that is a sore point with a lot of the constellation folks and with the folks working exploration on how to interact with these tools that can be somewhat cumbersome.
Yeah, IT is also a technology, and the T, right? Technology.
T for technology.
I got that part.
Georgia Tech.
Yeah, Georgia Tech. There we go. But I want to point out that in addition to the types of IT services that Steve's talking about, all the mission planning tools, all the autonomy kind of software advances, those are all part of IT as well. And I think that as those technologies mature, they'll have dramatic impact on our missions, both robotic and in human spaceflight.
One more question from Marshall.
Yes. How do you see some ways that the Chief Technologist Office and engineering across the agency collaborating to improve our performance across the agency?
Okay. I'll take a shot at that first, and then you can jump in if you like. So first of all, let me just say that Mike Ruszkiewicz here, the chief engineer here at NASA headquarters, and I work together very closely. Mike and I have been colleagues for a while. On bad days, I blame Mike for me being here, and on good days, I thank him because he was instrumental in bringing me up to NASA headquarters. Mike's role and my role, I think, overlap somewhat. Mike is focused very squarely on core competencies in the agency, sustaining capabilities, those sorts of things. But he also has a strong interest in our agency's technological future. I'm focused more on the agency's technological future, but obviously in getting there, I have to also be interested, and I am interested, in the competencies of our workforce and making sure that we have the capabilities to implement these future missions within the agency. I found Mike and the whole chief engineers organization, actually across the centers, not just here at headquarters, to be a very good partner in setting up these new technology programs and in helping us plan them and helping us plan the implementation of those programs. I've also followed Mike's model. Mike has chief engineers at all the centers, and as you may know, we now have chief technologists at all the centers. And those chief technologists are my entry point, my eyes and my ears, if you will, at each center. They serve a number of purposes. They allow me to have a presence, a virtual presence, if you will, at the centers. They're, when something comes out of my office, they're almost always the first to know about it. And also they serve as a source of innovation from the centers, gathering that information and bringing that information up to headquarters so that I can hear about those innovations quickly. And that's a model of working that I frankly learned by watching the way Mike Ruszkiewicz runs his organization. So I think we're partnered fairly well, and I think we will continue to be so over these next few years.
And we stood up in the engineering organizations under Mike's leadership engineering steering committees across the technical disciplines that include the division leadership from all the engineering organizations from around the agency, including the NESC. And a lot of those folks from that workforce that encompasses the total engineering workforce within the agency is working hand in hand with Bobby's organization, OCT, to develop the OCT roadmaps, strategic roadmaps for cross-cutting technology. So they are, in fact, the same people in a lot of cases. And to me, engineering and technology have to go hand in hand. Whether it's technology pool, if you're developing a deep space habitat or some kind of new vehicle, new element, needs technology investments early on in order to enable systems to perform at the levels you need in particular architecture. It's also, engineering is wrestling with some of the toughest problems, some of the unsolvable problems, then where can technology help? And so technologists helping to answer and bring technology to bear to help the engineers solve some of the most technical problems goes hand in hand. It'd be nice to see the research centers working on the technologies that will answer those questions that the flight programs need solved in order to implement these greater and greater missions. So that's kind of the relationship at a high level. And then Bobby gave you the details about how he's implementing it. And so I think it is meshed pretty well together, very well together in very short order. It's doing good, and it's in large part due to Mike Ruszkiewicz's leadership and Bobby's leadership.
It's a very good partnering and collaboration, obviously, in these areas. Mm-hmm. We have a question here at headquarters.
Yes, the question's really for both of you, and it follows on what Steve just said. Though to an extent, and it really has to do with space safety and human spaceflight safety. In your discussion, it sort of was as if, well, innovation and safety are at odds with each other, or your two offices might be at odds with each other. But as Steve points out, obviously one needs the other. And when you look, NASA has a proud history, I would say, with aviation of bringing safety up to a higher level. Whereas if you don't bring innovation in, say with human spaceflight, we're probably going to have the same level of safety. So one question, I have two, but they're related. One is, how do you, from a human spaceflight, try to bring innovation into the game, specifically to improve safety, not just for innovation, but you look and you say, from a safety standpoint, we need to innovate to take leaps and bounds in safety. The second is, obviously, there's commercial cargo to station, commercial crew to station. NASA will play an invaluable oversight, insight roles, informed dissent, as you said. But how do you take it to the next level from just informed dissent to fostering innovation that, from a safety standpoint, improves human spaceflight?
Right, so I'll take a first cut at that one. It's human spaceflight related. So, we have to consider, if we're going to go beyond low Earth orbit, right, into exploration, we've got to consider our stance on safety and risk acceptance. As we go out into the solar system and try to embark on missions that are 12, 16 months long beyond high Earth orbit, those are inherently more risky. And so we're going to have to deal with the safety issues that come along with that. Some of those issues are long-duration radiation exposure, right? Consumables and life support systems that have to support and sustain humans for that period of time. We're at a limit today under our current technologies of how far and how fast we can go beyond exploration. So we're going to need innovation, and we are going to absolutely to execute these missions. It can't necessarily be done today with the technologies and the level of systems that we have. For example, specifically in life support, we have life support systems on space station that we're learning from day to day on its reliability. So we need the innovation to increase its reliability, lower its mass, lower its volume in order to package it better, lower its spare count or its failure rates so that we can take it out into deep space and have it be a system that can support the crew. So there's a specific example of where innovation is necessary to break the barriers that enable those further exploration missions. The other part of your question was commercial crew, right? And so one of the things associated with that, I think we have not yet reconciled that within the agency in terms of what is the value, where can the government provide that innovation to enable their success. And in particular, I feel passionate about it's in the area of crew safety systems, right? And so if you're talking about those high energy phases of flight or those areas where NASA has the bulk of the experience from trial and error and from history, we need to be able to find a way to put that expertise back into the new emerging commercial space sector. Those are in areas of ascent abort, of entry, descent, and landing, of guidance, navigation, control, in rendezvous and proximity operations and docking. Those kinds of areas are areas that the preponderance of the expertise, not all of it, but a large amount of it, resides on the government side. So how do we best, I think the best way is to allow us to subsidize or provide that experience in some form to the commercial sector, allow them to innovate. Their processes, their new way of doing business, their business models are fundamentally different than NASA. So we're learning from them, and then they can learn from our tried and true experiences in that case. And I think in the area of crew systems is the place where we ought to focus.
I just add one point to that. We innovate, we seek innovation for a number of reasons, right? We might seek innovation for performance benefits to enable missions that we can't actually accomplish today, that we might be able to accomplish in the future. We seek innovation, industry generally seeks innovation to reduce cost or for commercial reasons. And certainly innovation can be sought as a means of safety improvement as well. These are not orthogonal or exclusive domains. And so while NASA does need, in my view, to innovate to enable our future missions, we certainly need to be innovative in safety systems as well.
Question? Yes.
I think you've built a solid case for our need for innovation. Do you believe that we have removed the obstacles that we need to allow for that innovation in our workplace? I mean, I believe we have the most passionate, talented workforce. I don't think we need to, find those innovative people. I think we have them, but I personally think that we've perhaps buried them a little bit, and it goes back to the risk. What's our risk posture? So I'd be interested in what you think we need to do, or if we're there.
Yeah, I don't think we're there. Let me just be candid about that. So one of the things that I've done in these first few months is I've traveled around to almost all the centers. I need to admit I wanted to get to Goddard, and my trip got canceled, so I need to get back out there. I'm coming, Rob. Rob Strain told me that Goddard would be the last place I would go, because it's the closest, and he was right. Unfortunately. But I've been to all the other centers at this point, and your premise is totally correct. There are strong, technically motivated, passionate, caring people, strong engineers, strong scientists at all of our centers. And frankly, going to the centers has been, among the best experiences of my time in the second stint here at here at NASA. just hearing the ideas, hearing the passion from people at the different centers, things that they want to work on, things that they think are possible, actually things that they've kind of kept alive somehow with little bits of funding here and little bits of funding there, despite the best interest, despite whatever program they were supposed to be working on at the time. I'll just say that. It's remarkable. And so there's no doubt in my mind that we have the raw material, in other words, the talent, to be innovative. But what we need to do is remove those stumbling blocks. And right now, in my view, the agency is too process-oriented to allow that innovation to flourish as well as it could. Now, I mean, sure, that the innovation occurs sometimes. It occurs despite our efforts to stop it in some cases, and it occurs on its own in other cases. But one of the things that my office is going to be doing is taking a hard look at the NASA culture, the systems engineering culture, and the systems engineering rigor that is both required and is sometimes stifling. And we need to figure out a way. I don't have all the answers. Okay, I'll admit that. We need to figure out a way to have that rigor when we need it for our flight projects, but allow that creativity and that innovation, that spark of an idea, to get worked on, and to allow that seed to flourish before we attack it and say what's wrong with it, and to bring all the agency's processes to bear on that idea. Now, there hasn't been a way to do this previously. There hasn't been a source of funding. But one of the things that we are planning is the Center Innovation Fund. And the Center Innovation Fund is designed for this purpose. It's designed to nurture and to grow innovation at each of the centers. And this fund is going to be managed not at a headquarters. It's going to be managed locally at each of the 10 centers by either the center director or the center chief technologist. And they're going to invest in a portfolio of innovative ideas, innovative either concepts or process improvements or what have you. So there is actually a way to fund these kinds of things now. And what we need to then do is take a little care with our culture to make sure that those really innovative ideas are given the time and the energy needed to grow.
I think I wanted to add a little bit to that. I agree. Our workforce is a superior, highly motivated, capable workforce, innovative workforce. Mm-hmm. We have created a culture in the agency, and it's up to the leadership of the agency, us in the leadership roles, to peel away those barriers that you speak about and allow the innovation to flow up out of the organization. It's unshackling, I guess, is the way to look at it. I started a project, and Bobby was picking on me a little bit about getting things done with little or no authority or money. I started a project back in November called Project M, right, which you know about it, right? So we were going to put a walking robot on the moon in 1,000 days, and we started it with a LOX methane lander and autonomous landing and hazard avoidance technology on it. It was a technology-rich project for the sake of demonstrating NASA's prowess and can-do, innovative attitude. It was really about my workforce and trying to get the workforce latched on the idea that can't shouldn't be in the vocabulary, that we can do in spite of the barriers that are in front of us. And by having something like that as a motivating force goes so much further than any kind of process improvement study, or let's go rewrite this particular document, or let's go study this, do a value stream mapping on this process, or if you go back and you figure you've got to get this done with an insanely impossible schedule, with essentially no money, go find innovative ways to get it done in spite of all that stuff, they'll find ways through. And they've uncovered a number of process insensibilities, I guess you'd call them, why does shipping take so long after it enters the loading dock? Why does to get a computer take so long to move it across the room? I mean, they just had so many little things that got in their way, and then they said, well, let me just find a way around it because I have to get this job done. And that forcing function is the key. So while we have things like the Center Innovation Fund and some other ideas, the challenge for us as leaders is going to be is trying to do this on a broader scale, where we can have more wholesale changes from that perspective, as opposed to these brilliant pockets of innovation that are occurring all over the agency every day. How do you stitch those together to create something that's more powerful?
We have time for one more question here. And yes.
So let's see, kind of following up on that topic that we just had, I think that's great. You know, innovation really is the core of what we do here and why we're here. And I know that when my colleagues and even myself found out about the Project DAM, we were all, yeah, I want to do that. It's very exciting. But one of the questions I have more for the Office of Chief Technology in your process is, you know, technology development happens within Steve's organization, and it happens within other centers as well. I assume you don't feel in competition with them, but when would you expect them to come to you and say, we need help in this area? Or, you know, what is your relationship between what you're doing and what the other technology development programs are doing across the agency?
These need to be 2 short answers, I'm told.
Short answers.
Yeah.
Okay.
60 seconds each.
Our relationship's good. How's it? No.
I concur.
Yeah. So
That's good.
just very quickly, there are technology programs within each of the mission directorates, and we talked about that actually early. And those are, you know, technology pull kind of programs that tend to flow from the specific missions of a mission directorate. And then the Office of the Chief Technologist is focused on what I call technology push. So what are the beyond requirements? What are the strategic set of technologies, some of which may not be directly called for by a mission today, but if we had them in hand, could enable not just one, but perhaps a dozen missions in the future. Those are the types of things that we're focused on in the Office of the Chief Technologist. Now, I don't think we're in competition with anybody because, you know, here at NASA headquarters, you know, we don't have an engineering workforce to actually implement any of those things. These will all be implemented at the NASA centers or in industry or in academia or in teams of people across those different pieces of the aerospace sector together. Okay?
Steve, you have 20 seconds.
20 seconds really key. The whole point about it is relationships. So if we have strong relationships between us as a community, technologists and engineering, right, leadership, chief technologists and engineering directors, we can solve just about anything. And so if you can pick up the phone, this is something I tell my folks all the time, if you can pick up the phone and say, look, I need some help. I've got this problem. I've got this technology. I've got to pursue it. I need a little help with that. Typically, you can get that resolved that way. So I think the foundation of innovation, the foundation of moving us forward is in building strong relationships amongst us all. And as soon as we do that, we can start to have the conversations. And there's no tough conversation that we can't have once you have a relationship. And so to me, that's the key to everything.
Pretty good. I want to thank our masters, Steve Altemus and Bobby Braun, for devoting their time and spending it with us. And I want to also thank the audience here, also at the field locations, for the good interactive questions and taking us into a different direction. I also want to refer, since Bobby brought it here, he brought the current issue of Ask Magazine, and I think he brought it because he's interviewed in Ask Magazine. So, yeah, well.
Come on, I haven't read it yet.
That's, but the interview, I'm sure, is good, yeah. And I want to thank you all, and stay in touch with us in terms of what we're doing. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed.
Good job.
You did a great job.
Thank you, Ed. Thanks, Ed. Appreciate it. That was great.